Hello, this is Santa Rick Irwin, and this message is addressed to the members in good standing of the organization formerly known as the Fraternal Order of Real Bearded Santas. These past 10 days have been confusing and trying times for us all, and I have endeavored to not participate in the firestorm which the former leadership has stirred up on Facebook, an open social network available to the public and the media. In fact, I have only commented twice so far. On day 2, I issued a cease and desist order to them, telling them to stop defaming me, at least in public. In that same communication, I noted that I was eager to have an open and honest dialogue with them, but only on our members-only social network, which has served this purpose since its creation in October 2009. My only other public statement has been a disclaimer when someone copied an internal communication from the new FORBS president and posted it on Facebook as a response to the board in the bubble. I wanted to make it clear that no founder of the new FORBS had posted it, since all of us have been trying really hard to stay out of this fray. At least the public meltdown part. However, it's been 10 days now, and the mudslingers and the blame throwers have not lightened up on their torrent of propaganda. And now their surrogates, apparently accepting all that propaganda at face value, are working hard to convince the members of our constituent chapters to divorce themselves from the now regional Fraternal Order of Real Bearded Santas. It finally occurred to me yesterday that I couldn't even really blame those surrogates. When only one side in a disagreement is being heard, it's kind of hard to be fair and balanced. So for many reasons, not the least of which is my desire to salvage a number of old friendships, I'd like to address 10 of the more absurd statements being made with this amicus brief. Let's begin with this little bit of libel. Callahan and Irwin stole the name of FORBS from its rightful owners. Never mind the question that fairly leaps to mind. If you own something that was stolen from you, know who stole it and where it is, then why don't the authorities recover it for you? Seems like a problem with the authorities, not us. But even beyond that, Bob Callahan and I did not steal FORBS's name. It was taken back from the former national organization by the state of California, who originally issued it. Not only did Bob and I have nothing at all to do with this action, we knew nothing at all about it. This notice on the Secretary of State's website was first discovered on April 27th by a third party who brought it to our attention. I imagine you would have been every bit as curious as we were when we read it. Now, there are some who feel that we should have just notified the board at this point and let it go at that. What those folks don't know is, Bob and I weren't the only victims of FORBS' twin towers of arrogance and abuse. Ron Robertson and Rob Figley have run off a lot of hard-working volunteers who had knowledge and experience critical to FORBS. For one thing, they seem to have a phobia against admitting anytime they make a mistake. And for another, the last time a member asked them embarrassing questions on our members-only social network, they tried to destroy the network. So we knew better than to ask them for any explanation of all this. But I still wanted a few more details, which that official notice failed to include, such as, why was FORBS being shut down? I contacted the Secretary of State's office and was told that I could order a certified copy of their official transcripts, which I was glad to do. However, as you can see, when that report arrived, it was also pretty sparse on details. The California Franchise Tax Board told us that their nonprofit status had been revoked, but not why. And the California Attorney General told us that they had an open file on FORBS, but again, not why. In fact, they asked me twice if I might be able to supply them with any further information. But as with the other agencies, they declined to tell us what they had in their file. So we were left to wonder, would there be any criminal charges filed? And if so, against whom? One thing all of these authorities did agree on, though. Anyone in the United States could claim the name of our organization. Even Nick Trolley, or Jeff Gurman, or that wackadoodle Jim Nobles who's been stalking our leadership. Now, I admit I'm far from impartial on this topic, but on any thinking person's director-officer responsibility rating scale, wouldn't that have to fall somewhere between incredible incompetence and criminal negligence? And yet we have not seen one resignation from this board in the bubble. Our financial team betrayed us. We had no idea about all this. Now, this lie is despicable. Not only is it untrue, it's a deliberate attempt to shift their blame onto someone who quit because of their abusiveness. This board in the bubble has failed most spectacularly in the areas of financial accountability. Year after year, they have failed to provide a financial statement to the membership within 120 days of the start of our fiscal year as required in our bylaws. They also failed to provide host chapters with a detailed accounting for this year's luncheon within the deadline promised during board meetings. They have failed to post any financial records of any kind, including conflict agreements, which our bylaws state that each director and officer is required to sign annually, and which specifically forbids them from taking member dues money to pay for that road trip which they called a board retreat. And just for good measure, they've been so rude and abusive towards the financial volunteers that they all quit. They actually now have the chutzpah to blame their failure of oversight on these financial volunteers. Besides, I know for a fact that they were warned to check their IRS forms 6 months ago, at least twice. You see, I sent both of those warnings myself. Looking back now, it seems almost inevitable that when the end came for them, it would be because of this dereliction of their fiscal oversight duties. I think most members would agree that they should have saved the money they spent hiring a professional webmaster to lighten Rob Figley's workload and spent that money instead to hire a certified public accountant who knew how to keep our financial records straight. On February 13th of this year, I exercised my legal rights as a dues-paying member of a California-based 501c7 mutual benefit corporation with more than 500 voting members. And I served all directors and officers with a properly formatted member demand for statutory disclosure. For the second time, I might add. In it, I specifically itemized their various ongoing errors and omissions for them, including detailed citations of relevant California statutes and U.S. codes. That document ended by warning them all that Forbes' nonprofit status was at risk, as were any protections provided by their errors and omissions or directors and officers' insurance policies. If even one of those 11 men had bothered to click a mouse over the next 49 days, they could have saved Forbes. And after all of that, I have to wonder, where do they even find the gall to blame anyone but themselves for their failure? And what type of self-delusion allows you to come up that short on your duty and your word and not find the honor within yourself to resign? The board's only response to my member demand for statutory disclosure came from Chairman Jack Grimes. He said, "As for Mr. Irwin's demands, the answer is no," adding specifically, "Our Form 990s are on GuideStar. Rick can go there to see them." When I went to GuideStar.com, which is the clearinghouse for nonprofit info, I discovered that not only would I have to pay to view those documents, as Jack suggested I do, what I found there left me wondering whether those forms were even being filed as required by law. GuideStar evaluates nonprofit organizations in 7 categories, and they gave Forbes a failing grade in 5 of them. More to the point, according to the highest-ranking member of the board in the bubble, their official repository of public records has also been telling them that they have a problem, just as I've been doing, and the board in the bubble has been busy ignoring them as well. I find it incredible that not one of these 11 men seemed to have bothered to actually do what the chairman was telling members to do. Too bad for them, too, because if they had, they could have spared themselves and each other all of this. Nearly every director and officer I have heard or read in the past 10 days has used this line over and over and over. After being warned by GuideStar of the potential problems with Forbes taxes, I decided to go straight to the source, the IRS. Here I finally caught a break. The U.S. IRS let me search 42,972 tax exemption Form 990s that had been filed by groups like ours since 2008. Now, their software was primitive and their servers were slow, and they only delivered about 250 files per minute, and they only allowed next page, previous page scrolling. So it took a while. But they did allow alphabetic scrolling, so I found Forbes somewhere between 9,000 and 9,250. Counting the time it took to locate the database, about an hour. I found just 2 filings from Forbes, and both of those coincide with my term of service as a director and officer. After their implosion, the board in the bubble was understandably deluged with questions by the members, many of which were variants of, "If you guys messed up our taxes and titles, why should I trust you with my dues money?" They very cleverly sidestepped the vast majority of those questions by simply declaring a 1-year dues amnesty and saying things like, "Our third-party merchandise and service vendors will still accept your money," as if you should think this were some sort of accomplishment you should be grateful to them for. But when one member persisted in questioning their nonprofit status, this is what they told him: "We were and are good with the Franchise Tax Board." I'll let you decide whether they were being dumb or dishonest. Either way, it took about 2 minutes to disprove, and they never retracted or corrected it for the members. I find this one personally offensive. Callahan and Irwin were not both legally removed from the board. First of all, every member who joined more than 2 years ago, which I believe is all directors and officers, knows that I resigned all 3 elected offices which I held exactly 2 years ago this month, when I discovered that Robertson and Figley had too much power and too little honor. Bob Callahan was stripped of his elected office for refusing to obey an illegitimate gag order, which would have made him violate Forbes bylaws, which he helped write and rewrite, as well as a number of relevant U.S. codes and California statutes as well. Bob understood that every member of a fraternity like ours was guaranteed the legal right to contact any other member or leader, and that our group was required by law to make that possible by maintaining an accurate roster showing the names, voting status, and contact information for every dues-paying member. For weeks he begged, cajoled, and pleaded with them to obey the law and our bylaws, until they decided finally that he had to go, or they would never have any peace. So they made up a new rule, agreed amongst themselves that their new rule was a higher authority than our bylaws, and they stripped an honorable Santa of a title bestowed upon him by the membership. But trust me, they didn't even put a dent in either his integrity or his dignity. Now this one is so ridiculous it's almost comical. In their simple world, bigger always equals better, so they just can't understand why we decided to limit the geographic region of the new Forbes. When I first joined the Santa world, I was inspired by Bob Callahan's quiet wisdom and tireless energy, and over those 3 years of 60-hour weeks working to build Forbes, I was only following Bob's example. From folks like Bob Callahan and Nelson Burke and Dottie Runke, I learned to find a need and fill it. Considering my vocabulary and literary skills, I naturally wound up writing most of the documents Forbes relied upon for its guidance and government. And considering my almost total lack of experience in running an organization such as ours, this meant spending hundreds of man-hours online, doing research, locating and verifying references, familiarizing myself with city, county, state, and federal laws. And that was all before I sat down to write the actual policies and procedures. During Forbes' early years, I was their great communicator. But in addition to my language skills, I also happen to have a computer science degree that's older than the internet. So I understood more clearly than any other director or officer just how vital the World Wide Web would prove to our mission. For nearly a year, our fledgling fraternity languished with a primitive website created using free design software by someone with more will than skill, until I created an exemplar site to show the directors what we were missing, and they immediately elected me webmaster as well. The membership twice elected me director at large, and until the day I resigned, I was the only director and officer to hold 3 elected titles at once. So you can clearly see how disinterested I was in the affairs of the greatest Santa fraternity in the world, right? Oh yeah, and I almost forgot my day job. I've been an entertainer for over 35 years, and my wife and I own an entertainment production company, Rick and Vic Productions, LLC. Over the past 5 or 6 years, as the nation's economy slipped further and further from recession towards depression, live entertainers such as Singin' Santa and Diva Claus have felt the pinch even more than Joe the Plumber. But that hasn't stopped us from donating thousands of dollars worth of studio time, camera work, and production services to our fellow jolly gents. Many professional Santas taped their first interview with us, and we have helped many others bring their marketing into the digital age. Now this one shows the true depths of corruption for some of these guys. For about 24 hours after our attorney served the board in the bubble with that cease and desist order, asking them to stop using our name, I was vilified and demonized without mercy on public social networks such as Facebook, as well as semi-public networks such as ClawsNet. And by the second day of this, I'd had enough, so I served the directors and officers of the entity formerly known as FORBS with another cease and desist letter. I ordered them to stop making further defamatory statements about me on any network accessible to the public or the media. The next day, Director Keeney went back on Facebook to admit that their legal team had assured them that my C&D notification was legitimate, and that he could be sanctioned by authorities if he failed to respect my rights. So he named 2 specific surrogates who would be spewing their propaganda for them until further notice. One of them was Gordon Bailey, who I believe was sincerely fooled by our side's unfortunate decision not to engage in the debate raging on Facebook, and began believing the only side that was being argued. I'm not so certain about Ian Loxton, since Diva and I have thought of him as a friend for many years, and have defied the 17-hour time difference between us to Skype with him for hours on end. I must admit that I was particularly hurt by how quickly and how completely Ian turned on me and began to attack. But I'll continue to give both Gordon and Ian the full benefit of the doubt, and assume that they were sincerely mistaken. However, I can't be so forgiving with Keeney and the other directors who are using these poor guys as surrogates. Now, these last 2 aren't from Facebook. In fact, they predate the implosion by the board in the bubble. I include them here simply to round out the list and to demonstrate the heights of arrogance and depths of insolence these pretenders have plumbed. This is an exact quote of Ron Robertson's reply to a member at a chapter meeting when he was asked why FORBS members hadn't been consulted about changing the logo or choosing a penguin as a mascot. He said, "We're too big for the board to ask members for opinions or approval. You elected us to make decisions for you, and we're going to do it." Now, that would have earned him a place on this list just for its sheer absurdity value, or as an indicator of just how far this board in the bubble had strayed from our founding promises of openness and transparency and accountability. But for me, it also leads to the last item. All 15 of these road trip proposals became official FORBS policy right after their return from that controversial members' dues-financed vacation in Indiana, without explanation to, approval by, or even input from the membership of FORBS. Those same members who originally chose those logos, bylaws, etc., which the board in the bubble were now discarding so arbitrarily and condescendingly. For me, the final straw was number 13 on that list. Move that questions from members go to the corresponding secretary, who will send each question to the appropriate board member to answer via the PR chair, JG, who will send answer to the member. To be certain that members would only be reading the official propaganda from the board and the bubble, they decided to make up another new rule, which was also never reviewed or approved by the membership, by the way. What they're actually saying is, from now on, the president's wife will have authority to choose which director can be allowed to read what message from members, and our PR guy will decide what members get to read. I couldn't make this stuff up if I was working with Steven Spielberg, Aaron Sorkin, and Chuck Lorre. So, here's my final and official response to this statement, which must surely be the most absurd claim of all. You're kidding, right? After watching for years in helpless frustration as these guys drove my beloved fraternity towards this very cliff, after warning them repeatedly that this cliff was up ahead, after watching them drive my beloved FORBS over a number of our founders who got in their way as they barreled along toward this cliff, and then one day, after all your worries and prayers, you walk around a corner and you find their only set of keys half buried in the mud. Now, consider all the absurd lies they've been telling you. Take a deep breath, look deep into your heart, and ask yourself, would you go knock on their door and just return the keys to them? Really?